the boat that Adolf Hitler called the New Noah. In the spring of 1943, a captured German officer sat across from American interrogators in North Africa and told them something the Allied High Command already suspected but had not yet proven. The invasion the Germans feared most was not a landing at a port. Ports could be fortified, mined, ringed with coastal guns, and studied for years in advance. What the German General Staff feared was a landing on open beach at a place with no harbor at all, because that meant the entire coastline of Europe was a target, and no stretch of it could ever be considered safe. For 3 years, that fear had been mostly theoretical, because no army in the world possessed a vessel that could reliably put large numbers of men, jeeps, artillery, and tanks onto an undefended beach and pull back out again for another load, again and again under fire on a schedule. Then, in the autumn of 1942, off the coast of French Morocco and Algeria, and again in July of 1943 on the beaches of Sicily, and again in June of 1944 at 5 beaches in Normandy codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, that vessel showed up in numbers the Germans had not planned for. It was 36 feet long. It was built mostly of plywood, with a steel-plated ramp bolted to its blunt bow. It drew barely 3 feet of water fully loaded, which meant it could run up onto sand that would strand almost anything else afloat. It carried a crew of 4 and could deliver 36 combat-loaded infantrymen, or a jeep and a squad, or a 6,000-pound artillery piece directly onto a beach in a matter of seconds, then reverse off the sand and go back for more. The United States Navy's official designation for it was Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. Nobody who served on one ever called it that. They called it, and history remembers it as, the Higgins boat. Dwight Eisenhower, the man who commanded the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare, gave his verdict on this vessel almost 20 years after the war ended, in a 1964 interview with the historian Stephen Ambrose. Eisenhower said plainly that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for the Allies. He did not stop there. He went on to explain that without Higgins designing and building those landing craft, an amphibious force could never have come ashore over an open beach, and the entire strategy of the war would have unfolded differently. Adolf Hitler, on the other side of the same equation, reportedly reached for a different kind of compliment. He is said to have called Higgins the New Noah, a boat builder whose creation, in the Führer's telling, had rescued an army rather than a species. To understand how a boat could earn praise like that from both sides of a world war, you have to go back to a swamp. A boat nobody in Washington wanted. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born in 1886 in Columbus, Nebraska, a landlocked prairie town 1,000 miles from open water. He had no naval background, no engineering degree, and no patience for institutions that moved slowly. By the 1920s, he had relocated to New Orleans and was running a small lumber business, and it was there, trying to get logging boats through the shallow, obstacle-choked waters of the Louisiana bayous and the lower Mississippi Delta, that he designed a shallow draft hull with a recessed, tunnel-protected propeller that could run through mud, sandbars, and floating debris without fouling. He called it the Eureka. It was built for trappers and oil drilling crews who needed a boat that could push up onto a riverbank, unload, and back off again without help. Higgins thought the design might have a military application and offered it to the Navy. The Navy's Bureau of Ships turned him down flat, uninterested in a design from an unproven outsider far from the traditional shipbuilding centers of the East Coast. Higgins did not let it go. In 1938, the Navy finally agreed to let him build a prototype landing craft on a small budget and put it in competition against 3 other designs, all of them from established naval architects with conventional V-shaped hulls, high sides, and sharp bows built for open ocean, not for beaching. Higgins's boat was the only flat-bottomed, blunt-nosed design in the trial, and it outperformed all 3 competitors in both calm water and 5-foot seas. In February 1939, after the Eureka had already proven itself the previous year in Fleet Landing Exercise 5 off Culebra, Puerto Rico, the Navy and Marine Corps tested it again during fleet exercises, and it again surpassed the Navy's own in-house design. There was still one problem, and it was not a small one. Men and equipment had to be unloaded and disembarked over the sides of the Eureka, which meant exposing soldiers to enemy fire at the exact moment they were most vulnerable, climbing over a gunwale with a rifle and a pack. The solution to that problem did not come out of a naval design bureau either. It came from a photograph. The photograph from Shanghai. In 1937, a young Marine Corps officer named Victor Krulak was serving as a military observer in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. At the Battle of Shanghai, Krulak watched Japanese forces land troops from small boats with drop-down ramps built into the bow, vessels of the Daihatsu class, that let soldiers run straight off the front of the boat instead of climbing over the side. Krulak understood immediately what he was looking at and photographed it. He sent the photograph back to Washington, where the Navy dismissed it as the idea of an eccentric observer with no real naval expertise. Krulak found a more receptive audience when he brought the same idea to Higgins, who built ramp bow prototypes almost immediately. Within a month, tests of the ramp-equipped Eureka on Lake Pontchartrain outside New Orleans proved conclusively that the design worked. The usefulness was so obvious and so immediate that the Navy amended its existing contract with Higgins mid-production to add the ramp to every remaining boat on the order. What emerged from that amendment was the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, the LCVP, 36 feet of plywood and steel, powered by a single diesel engine, armed with 2 light machine guns at the bow, capable of carrying 36 combat troops or a vehicle across open water and depositing them onto dry sand through a ramp that dropped in seconds. The design was simple by the standards of a Navy that built battleships and aircraft carriers. That simplicity was the entire point. A Higgins boat could be built in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost of any ocean-going vessel in the fleet by shipyard workers who did not need specialized training out of materials that did not compete with steel allocations needed for tanks and warships. It could be repaired on a beach with basic carpentry tools, and it could be produced in the kind of numbers that no conventional landing vessel ever could. 20,000 boats and a factory that never stopped. Higgins Industries had begun in 1938 as a single boatyard employing fewer than 75 people. By late 1943, with war orders pouring in from a Navy that had spent 4 years refusing to take Higgins seriously, the company operated several plants and employed more than 20,000 workers. Higgins ran his shipyards on a policy that was unusual for the American South in the early 1940s. He hired white men who had not been drafted, women, African-American workers, older workers, and disabled workers, and paid all of them equal wages for equal work. It was not philanthropy. Higgins needed hands on every shift, and he needed boats coming off the line faster than any yard in American history had ever produced small craft. Those crews built 20,094 boats for the Allied war effort before the war ended. Higgins boats, the larger landing craft mechanized that could carry a tank, and the PT boats that hunted Japanese shipping in the Pacific. None of it happened because Washington asked for it early. It happened because a boat builder from a landlocked Nebraska town spent most of a decade being told no by an institution that trusted its own drafting tables more than it trusted results on the water, and refused to stop building boats anyway. North Africa, Sicily, and the beach at Salerno. The first large-scale combat test came in November 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied landings in French Morocco and Algeria. It was followed in July 1943 by the invasion of Sicily, and then in September 1943 by the landings at Salerno on the Italian mainland, where General Mark Clark's Fifth Army came ashore in Higgins boats under fire from German positions dug into the hills above the beach. Each operation exposed problems that got fixed in the next production run. Armor plating added around the coxswain's position after crews were killed by machine gun fire through open plywood sides. Improved ramp mechanisms after early models jammed under load, better compartmentalization after boats that took a single hit below the waterline sank too fast for crews to escape. By the time the invasion of Normandy was being planned in 1943 and early 1944, the Higgins boat was no longer an experimental design being argued over in a Navy bureau. It was the standard unit of an entirely new kind of warfare, one in which an invading army did not need to capture a port before it could land in force. It could simply choose a beach. The morning of the 6th of June. On the morning of June 6, 1944, thousands of Higgins boats and their larger cousins put more than 150,000 Allied soldiers ashore across 5 beaches in Normandy in a single day. The image most people carry from that day, American soldiers crouched behind a steel ramp as it drops into the surf, then running forward into machine gun fire on Omaha Beach, is a Higgins boat. The famous Signal Corps photographs of Eisenhower and other senior officers touring the invasion beaches in the days that followed show the same boats beached in long rows on the sand, their ramps still down, waiting to reverse off and return to the transport ships anchored offshore for the next load. The same boats that landed troops on Omaha and Utah had already landed Marines across the Pacific, at Guadalcanal in 1942, then Tarawa, then Saipan, then Peleliu, then Iwo Jima, where volcanic ash and coral reefs stranded heavier landing craft, but the shallow draft Higgins boat could still get close enough to shore for troops to wade the remaining distance. The same design carried General Douglas MacArthur ashore in October 1944, when he waded onto the beach at Leyte in the Philippines, fulfilling the promise he had made when he was evacuated from the islands 2 years earlier. By March 1945, versions of the same landing craft were putting American engineers and infantry across the Rhine River into the heart of Germany itself. There was no theater of the Second World War, Atlantic or Pacific, where the outcome of a major amphibious operation did not depend on Andrew Higgins's plywood boats reaching a beach on schedule, under fire, and coming back for more. The verdict nobody expected. What makes the story of the Higgins boat unusual is not that it was useful. Plenty of equipment in the Second World War was useful. What makes it unusual is that the man who commanded the entire Allied effort in Europe, when asked directly what had made the invasion of Fortress Europe possible at all, did not point to a tank, a bomber, or a battleship. He pointed to a plywood boat built by a whiskey-drinking boat builder from New Orleans, who the Navy's own bureau had spent years refusing to take seriously. Eisenhower is reported to have grouped the Higgins boat alongside the Jeep and the C-47 Dakota transport as the 3 tools that, in his estimation, had won the war. Andrew Higgins died in New Orleans on August 1, 1952, 7 years after the war he had supplied ended, at the age of 65. He never held a Navy commission. He never commanded troops. He built boats in a swamp using a design the United States military establishment rejected for the better part of a decade before it finally admitted it had nothing better. By the time it admitted that, there was no time left to build anything else, which is, in the end, exactly why Andrew Higgins's flat-bottomed plywood boat, and not a more elegant design from a more respected shipyard, is the one that put an army onto the beaches of Normandy on the morning the war in Europe began to turn. If you've had a relative who came ashore in a Higgins boat, in any theater, in any year of the war, I'd be honored to hear their story in the comments. The unit, the beach, the year. The men who rode those ramps down onto the sand are almost all gone now. Their story is worth keeping.